creating cultural awareness and understanding. This is Culture Clique. Culture Clique is written and produced by KQAL-FM on the campus of Winona State University.
In today's world of smartphones and GPS, finding your way around is pretty easy. But what did people do before GPS? How did sailors navigate their way on the open seas? Today on Culture Clique, we find out about early marine navigation techniques with Winona State University Professor Greg Neidhart. Greg is the director of the Arts Administration program at Winona State University, but he was also a navigator in the U.S. Navy. Greg fills us in on the instruments and techniques sailors use to navigate, as well as why these navigation skills are still important and relevant in today's world. I'm Bill Stoneberg with Professor Greg Neidhart on Culture Clique. Welcome to the show, Greg. Thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure having you on the show. Like we were talking before, this is a topic that I think is really interesting because, in today's world, a lot of people don't even carry a map in their glove box in their car anymore. Everyone's using their phones and stuff. And it's, to me, I'm curious about how people found their way around, especially out at sea and stuff like that. I think it's kind of fascinating, so.
Well, I agree completely. Of course, for many, many, many years, people used the kind of the greatest map of all, and that would have been the sky.
Right.
For thousands and thousands of years, mankind found their way around the Earth by using this ever-moving map, the sky. So,
right.
And even today, people certainly refer to the skies, and even though we seem to have, sort of backed away from that a little bit in the age of GPS, we all know that GPS and satellites can be compromised, things can be hacked, and I think people are rediscovering. I don't want to say rediscovering astronomy. Astronomy has been popular for ages,
right.
But discovering, for example, the use of the stars in celestial navigation.
Mm-hmm.
So part of my talk at the Marine Art Museum last week dealt with celestial navigation and how the early navigators used celestial navigation, as well as the mariners in the early American Navy in the late 1700s, early 1800s.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, what time period are we asking? So early, late 1700s, early 1800s, that's, and then U.S. Navy, huh?
Right. Often when people think of the beginning of the U.S. Navy, they often think of the Continental Navy from the Revolutionary War.
Right.
But really, the perhaps the seeds of the Navy, were planted then, but really, the early American Navy happened, after the founding of the country in the late 1700s,
Okay.
the establishment of the Navy, and then we had these crises with Britain, again after the Revolutionary War, and then with the Barbary pirates, and with the French. We were involved in this quasi-war with the French in the late 1700s, and then the Barbary pirates again, and the British. So there was a need for an establishment of an American Navy, of a U.S. Navy, primarily to protect the merchants. We had a thriving merchant marine in the early America, and they were unprotected. And I think Congress saw a need for a Navy that would primarily protect our merchant interests. And from that, we have the beginning of the American Navy.
Oh, cool. So it's almost like an economic thing that happened that, to drive it.
It really is. I think if you sort of look at the kind of the seeds of the American Navy, going past the Continental Navy of the Revolutionary War, it really was to protect the merchant interests in many ways.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious. Can you give us a real generalized idea of like how they navigated? Like what kind of tools did they use, and how did that work, navigating by the stars?
Well, in many ways, they would use the same things that we use today when we navigate by the stars. The sextant, and you've probably heard of the
I've
sextant.
heard of that, yeah.
It was really sort of, developed really in the 1700s. I mean, we saw predecessors going back many, many, hundreds of years.
Okay.
With things like the astrolabe and the things like this. But the sextant really was sort of found its footing, if you will, in the kind of the late 1700s. And so by the time the American Navy was established, they were using sextants. So they would have been using celestial navigation. Of course, celestial navigation had been used for thousands of years.
Right.
But with the development of the marine chronometer in the 1700s, there was this very famous carpenter named John Harrison, an Englishman, and he developed these amazing marine chronometers. Really accurate clocks have been around for a while, but they couldn't take them to sea. But
Okay.
John Harrison was able to sort of develop these wonderful marine chronometers, and he solved what was called the longitude problem. A problem with celestial navigation or navigation at sea is the longitude issue. Latitude is a relatively easy thing to determine without a clock, but with a really accurate marine chronometer, which is just a really accurate clock, you can also determine your longitude. So now with the development of the marine chronometer in the 1700s, you now can really determine accurate positions for your latitude and for your longitude. And by the time the American Navy was established in the late 1700s, early 1800s, those captains and navigators really understood how to use chronometers and sextants quite well.
Okay. So how does so chronometer is like a really accurate clock that,
Yes.
that'll can withstand shaking around at sea,
I-
right?
Exactly, a clock, or in fact, I mentioned Harrison. He developed these 4 clocks called H1, 2, 3, and 4,
Okay.
and we go from these these massive clocks from H1, H2, and H3, and by the time he makes H4, it's like a large pocket watch.
Oh, wow.
So it's it's a large watch, but you've gone from this large clock, marine clock, to essentially a marine chronometer which you could hold in your hand. I would call that sort of the moonshot, if you will. They've gone from these really somewhat cumbersome big clocks to essentially a large watch, which is incredibly accurate. It's the kind of timepiece that you would have seen James Cook take on his Pacific expeditions in the 1770s, for example.
Okay. Cool. So how did they determine their latitude based on that?
Well, it was really the longitude issue.
Oh, it's the longitude.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Latitude is relatively easy. In fact, we have this thing called the North Star or Polaris. And really, if you can look at the sort of the angle between the horizon and Polaris, you can determine your latitude.
Okay.
So, for example, if Polaris is 10 degrees above the horizon, you're probably at 10 degrees north latitude, for example. Longitude was a little bit tougher because Polaris is always there. Polaris is almost always around what we would call the kind of the celestial North Pole. It's always right there. It's a few degrees off, but you always know that Polaris is always pretty much north. I mean, that's an easy one to sort of determine. So latitude can be determined quite easily. You and I could do this tonight. We'd just find Polaris and we would know what our latitude is.
Okay,
Longitude, though, you need, because there is no equivalent to Polaris for the east-west,
Right.
for using the meridians or determining longitude, we need an accurate clock. And with an accurate clock, and essentially, without going into detail, with the aid of an accurate clock or a marine chronometer and some math, you need to be able to do some calculations as well. You can determine your longitude. Essentially, an accurate clock tells you what your reference time is. For example, if you know that it's 12 noon in Greenwich, England, and that's called the prime meridian, it runs through, Greenwich is just a part of London. It's sort of the east part of London.
Okay.
And that's what we call the prime meridian. If you know it's 12 o'clock in Greenwich, England, for example, and the sun is right above, you know that's 12 noon. Well, if now you have a clock and it's, let's say, 2 o'clock, let's say it's 12 o'clock your time, but the time back in Greenwich is 2 p.m., that's 2 hours earlier. Well, we know that the sun moves at 15 degrees per hour. Oh. So we know that 15 degrees would be 1 hour. Another 15 degrees would be 2 hours. So if it is now 12 o'clock at our local time, it's 2 o'clock back at Greenwich, the sun has moved 30 degrees.
Oh, wow.
So we know that we are now 30 degrees west of the prime meridian.
Oh.
So they could use that, and there's a lot of math involved with this.
Okay,
but
sure.
Not beyond the scope of the reach of what the mariners could understand back then.
Right.
So they can now do these calculations at sea, and if they had an accurate timepiece, they could determine both latitude and longitude. And there are other ways to determine longitude and latitude as well. For years, they also used something called the lunar method. Also, they would use the moons of certain planets to determine, longitude. But it was very difficult to make those mathematical calculations. With the marine chronometer, it made it somewhat easier.
A little easier. Okay, cool.
And that's what we still use today.
That's fascinating. So, and then I want to back up just a little bit. When you were talking about latitude, right? In Polaris.
Yes.
So I'm going to take a stab in the dark here. Is that where the sextant comes in?
Well,
To
the
determine
sextant.
the degrees, or
Well, we use the sextant Polaris, but we also use the sextant for the navigational stars, and of
Okay.
course there are millions of stars. But we use 57 stars have been determined to be those are the navigational stars, and this really goes back a couple thousand years.
Oh,
But there are
wow.
57 years that we use for determining our position. We also use the sun. We use the moon, and we use 4 planets as well. So it isn't just the sextant to look at Polaris. We
Right.
use it primarily to look at the planets and the stars.
Okay.
So typically a navigator, if they want to determine their position, they would want to look at least 3 celestial bodies. It could be a
Okay.
planet, it could be stars, because that will give them what is called a 3-point fix, to get a line of
Right.
position or a 3-point fix, which helps them determine where they are. So the sextant is really just for determining angles. It's
Okay, sure.
that's all it really is, for determining angles between, our horizon, our position on Earth, and various celestial bodies.
Nice, nice. It's interesting because, you hear these terms thrown out once in a while, a sextant, stuff like that. And
Yes.
I'm like, how does that work? What is it? So it's pretty cool to hear that, you can determine the angle and the degrees of everything.
It is very cool, and it is a lost. I don't want to say it's a lost art because it was never lost, but years ago, the Naval Academy determined that it wasn't necessary for their students or their graduates to know
wow.
celestial navigation. They stopped teaching it in 2000. And I believe it was 2000. I'm not a Naval Academy grad. And I believe ROTC, Naval ROTC units stopped teaching it in 2006. Well, as we know, over the last couple of years, satellites can be compromised. They can be hacked. Things can happen. And so they determined a couple of years ago at the Naval Academy and ROTC that they need to start teaching this again.
Oh, good.
And I believe in 2016, they said we need to begin teaching this again. Now, the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, we do have a U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. They never stopped teaching it, but the Naval Academy and ROTC did stop, and now, once again, over the last few years, it is part of the curriculum for both ROTC units and the Naval Academy.
Cool. Well, that's not only kind of neat that they do that, but I would assume it's very useful. I mean, what if you get lost or you're, like you said, satellites can go down, things like that. So
Well, and people become so dependent on GPS.
Yeah.
And, so I think it's just a wonderful skill, and it's a way to get in touch with with nature in a way
Right.
that perhaps we've lost over the last, 10, 20, 30 years or so.
yeah, it's I sometimes, I look up the stars and it's a really big thought to think, well, that's over there, that's over there, it's this far away, so, I mean, knowing your position at sea, that's pretty fascinating to me. I think it's really cool. So what other kind of, so did they, like the early U.S. Navy in the time period we're talking about, late 1700s, early 1800s, did they all kind of use a universal method to navigate, or did it depend on the type of vessel, or?
Well, I don't want to say every mariner used a sextant. I mean, there are many methods that had been used for hundreds and hundreds of years that were probably still being used in the early days of the American Navy. One method of like crossing the Atlantic would be what is called sailing down the latitudes. In other words, it's easy to find the latitude.
Right.
So if you know what latitude your, let's say, port is that you're going to, let's say you're leaving New York and you want to go to Lisbon. Well, if you find the latitude of Lisbon, well, you go out to sea, you find your latitude, and you just sail down the latitude.
Okay.
And so it's not the fastest way to travel, but it is a way to know, you know that if you're on the latitude of, let's say, 40 degrees north and you sail down the latitude, you will eventually hit your port if your port is on that latitude.
Right.
And also in early American navigation, a lot like today, I guess navigation can be broken down to 3 areas. One would be celestial navigation.
Okay.
One would be electronic navigation, and we all know what that is,
Right.
GPS. And when I was a navigator in the Navy, we used satellites as well, not nearly as accurate as GPS. But we had satellite navigation and other forms of electronic navigation. We had systems like Loran Charlie and Omega. These were famous kind of land-based systems. And then the other system would be piloting. That's a big part of navigation. That would be sailing or operating near a shore because navigators had to get in to port without running aground.
Right.
You had to know about lighthouses and beacons and buoys and shoal water and how to read charts. So a big part of navigation simply is not, operating in the blue water, what we would call the brown water, operating near shore.
Okay.
And that is probably the more kind of the hair-raising part of navigation.
Yeah.
Getting out to sea is one thing, but then navigating near shore in a port, making sure you don't run aground, that's the nerve-wracking part of navigation.
Yeah, that sounds like that'd be the scary part,
It can be, very much so, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So you had mentioned charts.
Yes.
And one thing I've always wondered, is, you hear about charts, using charts at sea. What is the difference between charts and maps that we would use like on land?
Well, we use charts on the water, at sea, and in the air. We have aeronautical charts and then nautical charts. On land, we call them maps. Mm-hmm. And of course, maps might have political issues like state lines and city boundaries and things like this. Right. But a chart would be primarily, focusing on the sea and the land right around sea. For example, I would use a chart if I was, as I did many times, coming into Hampton Roads, which is near Norfolk, Virginia. Okay. I would use a number of charts, and the charts would have a lot of information about the terrain. It would show lighthouses and beacons. And at my talk last week, I talked about these two lighthouses at Cape Henry in Virginia Beach. And if you look at a chart, you could tell that how tall one of the lighthouses is, what kind of signal you will see when you look at this lighthouse. For example, the light will flash in Morse code.
Really?
The letter U, uniform, ... You know that it's 164 feet tall, and at that height, the light will extend for 15 miles in good visibility. Now, if you're on a ship, you're above the horizon 15 miles out, so there's a good chance that you can see the Cape Henry Lighthouse 20 miles or more away. So being able to read a chart, knowing how to read like the width of a channel, what kind of bottom you might find. For example, let's say we want to anchor it someplace. It might tell us if there's a sandy bottom or a rocky or a muddy bottom. It tells us where some obstructions might be. There might be a sunken wreck someplace. So reading a chart is very important. Yeah. And of course, the early American navigators in the early 1800s would have to know how to read charts. They weren't nearly as accurate, and many of the charts that they would use, just like many of the instruments, like sextants, would have been made in England. So, we had not really developed a thriving chart and map-making industry like they had in England, but the early navigators probably would have used a lot of materials that were actually manufactured in England.
Okay. Like for those early charts, because it sounds like they're really detailed now that you're talking about the type of bottom and everything and obstructions. Back then, when they're making charts here in the U.S., where would they get that information? Would they kind of just share information with each other and update the charts? Or?
Right. Well, now they do hydrographic surveys, but it's amazing, even today's charts. I was looking at a website about a week or so ago from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it showed all the the waters off the coast of Alaska, and it showed when they had been updated. And there were parts of the Alaskan coast that were last updated in the 19th century.
Oh, wow.
So this would probably have been determined by perhaps some surveys they did back then. But the early charts would have been based on the data that they would have collected from mariners around the world. Right. I remember sailing in the Caribbean in the Navy, and we would often find information based on admiralty charts from the 19th century that would show that a location had been last mapped in the 19th century. Oh, wow. And so it could have come from anecdotal information. I'm not a cartographer. Sure. But a lot of information would have been probably collected. Those early charts would have been built from just material that was collected by those early sea captains.
Wow. So I suppose it was really important when they were in somewhere new to gather new information for repeat voyages or for other vessels.
Absolutely. Especially if you're going to anchor, let's say, or you're sailing into a new port, you want to make sure you don't hit a reef or hit shoal water. Right. Or if you want to drop your anchor, is it going to be rocky or is it going to be muddy?
Okay.
And if your chart says that, one thing we talked about I talked about was the use of what's called the lead line. And that is what a ship would have used and could still use today to determine how deep water is. And so they would drop this piece of lead on a rope and determine how deep the water is.
Okay.
And at the bottom of these early lead lines, it would be carved out, and they would put tallow in there. And tallow, of course, is rendered fat from to make soap and candles. And they put tallow in there because when they would drop the lead line, when they pull it back up on the tallow, it would stick to whatever's on the bottom.
Oh.
And so if the chart might say, let's say the chart indicates mud, and they bring the lead line back up and there isn't mud there, but there's sand. Well, maybe they're perhaps in the wrong location. Oh. So, and that would be also a way to determine what the bottom is if you're sailing here for the first time.
Right.
So I'm afraid I've gone a little astray with the question.
No, that's
here.
great.
But just one of the things that they would have done to help build these early charts.
Right. So they're constantly updating and everything. That's really interesting how they'd find out how the bottom is, what's on the bottom.
Yep. And I know lead lines are still used today. When I first joined my ship, when I was first in the Navy, my ship sailed to Phuket, Thailand. Mm-hmm. And it was, this is many years after the Vietnam War, but they were the first American ship to enter Phuket Harbor. And so they weren't really sure what the depth of the harbor was. Uh-huh. And I had just missed the ship. I had flown in from Africa, and I was sitting on a small island in the Indian Ocean. Okay. And so I just missed the ship, so I was there for 2 weeks. But I heard when they came back that they actually put a lead line, a crew on a boat with a lead line, and they rowed the boat out. Well, they didn't row, they motored out in front of the ship, and it's just dropping lead lines to see how deep the water was. Wow. So lead lines can still be used today.
Yeah. I know I've used my anchor on the river sometimes when I don't have a depth finder.
Yeah.
Find out how deep it is.
Do you have it tied off at marks to see how deep it is? Or
no, I just kind of counted my hands. Like how many,
Oh, that works.
Guessing how many feet. So
as long as it's deeper than the draft of your boat, you're good.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't take that into account. There's a lot of stuff that went into this. That's really cool. And then another question I had was, we talked about how to chart your position, find out where you are at. How did they calculate distance and speed?
Well, they would use, initially, they would use something like a chip log. And a chip log is simply a piece of wood. Mm-hmm. The early chip logs were sort of based like a triangle, they were shaped like a triangle with ropes, tied to them. And then they would put knots on the rope every 48 feet or every 6 fathoms. Okay. And so what they would do, they would take an hourglass, and the hourglass would have about 28 seconds worth of water or sand. And so a person would stand at the taffrail or the back of the ship, the stern, and they would throw this log in the water, and as it would sort of reel out, they would count the knots going past the person. Oh. And after 28 seconds, they would turn it over. And they know if, let's say, 7 knots had played out, the ship was going 7 knots, which would equal 7 nautical miles per hour. Oh, wow. So they could determine, consequently we get the term knots, came from tying knots in the rope, in the chip log. And we know that knots, there's an equivalency with nautical miles. Uh-huh. So again, if we're traveling 7 knots, we're going 7 nautical miles per hour.
Cool. I always wondered where that term came from, knots, Yeah. That's neat. How does a nautical mile compare to like a mile on land? What's the difference? It's
just a little bit different. I mean, there is a difference, but they're not the same, but there is a difference in
just a slight difference.
And, you're right. And yes.
Okay, cool.
I'm drawing a blank on the exact equivalency, but it is just a little bit different.
Okay,
yes.
Okay. Just a yeah.
There's somewhat, yeah.
Yeah. So how about when they're sailing and they're plotting their course, they find out their position, they can calculate their speed. How do they factor in for wind and stuff when they're plotting their course? Do they have to do that? Or?
Well, yeah, they do, and that is called set and drift. So typically a ship would lay out a line. Let's say they get a fix. Maybe they get a fix off of a land feature, perhaps some lighthouses, maybe some buildings. They know where they are near land. Or if they're heading out to sea, they're getting celestial fixes from planets or stars, or maybe a noon fix. So they put a position on the chart, and then they just lay out a straight line of their course, and then maybe an hour or two later they get another fix, and they find that they're off. Well, it means that they've been pushed either by, it's called set and drift. Maybe they've been pushed forward or backwards, or they're off course. So then they get another position, they mark it again and lay out another course. Wow. So you might think that you're going 3 or 4 or 5 knots, but maybe you're going nowhere. Maybe you're being pushed backwards. Maybe you're being pushed to the left or the right. And so that's why you need to get periodic fixes to determine where exactly you are.
Right.
Of course, it helps if you have a lack of clouds when you're getting a celestial fix, or have really good GPS.
Okay. Okay. That's pretty complex. So were they, so like a navigator on a ship, they're pretty much constantly doing this then, right? To update or?
Well, I wouldn't say like every few minutes or so, but you would probably get celestial fixes in the morning and the evening for the planets and stars, and you could get a noon sight as well for the sun. Because during the daytime you typically do not see the planets. You might see a planet, but you typically do not see stars and planets. And the best time to catch the stars would be that half hour, right after sunset, or that half hour right before sunrise, twilight.
Okay, sure.
And because the navigational stars are really sort of prominent during those half hour periods.
Okay.
So when I would get when I would take celestial fixes, when I would shoot the stars, I would usually wait till right when the sun goes down. I have about a half hour to find my stars, and or do it in the morning, about a half hour before the sun comes up, because we still have some really bright stars and planets to shoot.
Right. Okay. And you've mentioned your time in the Navy. Is that what got you interested in celestial navigation, or early navigation?
Well, I think it goes back to maps. I just loved maps as a kid.
Cool.
I lived in southern Indiana, and my father worked for Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. But he worked out of Chicago, and he worked primarily in Minnesota and Iowa. And so I had this big map on my bedroom wall, and then he traveled all the time. So I got to follow my father on the map. Now, he would get home about once a week, but I would sort of follow him. And back when I was very young, gas stations or service stations used to give out free maps. Nice. And I never passed up an opportunity to get a free map.
Oh, cool.
And so I used to love maps. I just love maps. And celestial navigation was something I really began to think about after I, got into the Navy.
Right, right. And you were a navigator in the Navy, correct?
Well, my first job, yes. I was, there are 3 kinds of line officers, aviators, submariners or submariners, and then what are called surface warfare officers. They're the ones who, essentially are on ships. And I was a surface warrior. Not surface warrior, a surface warfare officer. And my first billet was as navigator of the USS Savannah, based out of Norfolk, Virginia. Nice. And I met it out in the Indian Ocean.
Oh, cool.
On its way to Oman and then the coast of Africa.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. It's a great job for someone who loves maps.
It was great. And for someone who had been a music major, I gave my music recital one day, and a year later I was taking a ship through the Suez Canal. So
wow,
it was a big leap. But
yeah, fascinating. So I'm curious, do you have a big collection of maps at home then?
No,
not anymore.
No. I've never really had I have maps. I have a few charts, but I don't collect charts. I have lots of maps, but mostly Texaco maps.
Sure.
And some aeronautical charts, but I don't really have a collection now.
Okay. Fair enough. What do you think is the most fun and interesting thing about these early navigation techniques?
I think it's just that connection with nature, maybe. The fact that I don't want to say it's primal, but you are really connected with nature in a way that I think most people are not these days.
Right.
I mean, more and more people live in the cities. We live in the cities. We can't even see the stars. We have to get out in the country to look at the heavens, if you will. And so I think when you're a navigator and you're in the middle of the ocean and you're not competing with glare for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, it connects you in a way that you can't be connected otherwise. So I think it's that connection with nature, that might be an answer, maybe not the answer, but it's the best I can think of right now.
Oh, I think that's fantastic. That's a beautiful thing to, see and realize your place, on this rock,
Yes.
basically.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I'm here with Greg Neidhart. He's associate professor in the music department here at Winona State University, and he's also the director of Arts Administration program, and he's a former Navy officer. And thank you for your service. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. We were talking about early navigation in the U.S. Navy. And the Minnesota Marine Art Museum also has an exhibit right now by the artist Martin Placha. It's called The Early History of the U.S. Navy, and kind of ties in with this talk. Now, Greg, some of the instruments and stuff you talked about, are they on display down at the museum right now?
They are not on display. We do have a collection, though. We have, in fact, the Marine Art Museum, instruments and objects going back to the 1600s. I think the oldest, and I may be wrong about this, I think it's a Dutch signal gun from the 1600s.
Oh, wow.
But then we have instruments as early as the 20th century. We have a long glass, which is a telescope. We have sextants. We have an octants. We have chronometers. It's a small collection, but it's a really nice collection. It's not being exhibited right now, but it is part of the collection. It was part of an exhibition about 10 years ago, but I don't know if it will be exhibited anytime soon, but it is in the collection of the Minnesota Marine Art Museum.
Cool. Well, I'm glad they have it at least,
Yes.
The Minnesota Marine Art Museum is a beautiful thing that we have here in town. I love that we have it,
It's amazing that we have this incredible, this gem located right here in Winona. Yes.
Yeah, it is. So I encourage everyone to get down there and see the Martin Placha exhibit. That's on display through August 18th here in 2019. And like I said earlier, I'm talking to Greg Neidhart, and we're talking about early navigation with the U.S. Navy. And thanks so much for being on the show today, Greg.
That's my pleasure.
Thanks again to Greg Neidhart for joining us today on Culture Clique. For information on the exhibit, The Early History of the U.S. Navy, being shown at Minnesota Marine Art Museum, go to mmam.org. To keep up on all things Winona and the surrounding area, tune into Culture Clique, Thursdays at 12:30, right here on 89.5 KQAL. I'm Bill Stoneberg, and we've been speaking with Professor Greg Neidhart on Culture Clique.
Creating cultural awareness and understanding. You've been listening to Culture Clique. Support for Culture Clique is made possible by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Culture Clique is produced by KQAL-FM on the campus of Winona State University. For more information, look us up on the web at kqal.org. And thanks for listening to Culture Clique.
Are you interested in all things Winona and the surrounding area? Find podcasts of Culture Clique and all your favorite KQAL shows by going to kqal.org and looking for program archives under the Media tab. Culture Clique is made possible by a grant from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.